What separates a good knitter from a great knitter? Hi everyone, Norman here. Have you ever looked at other people's knitting, or maybe you've seen some pictures on social media and you thought, wow, that just looks outstanding. I could never. Well, in this video I want to show you a couple of essential knitting techniques and concepts that will help you to elevate your knitting. Let's dive right into it. As a beginner, you might have been elated when you realized that a purl stitch always creates such a little bump in your fabric and a knit stitch a V. And this allowed you to read your knitting spot mistakes, but also knitting stitch patterns such as ribbing, moss stitch, siege stitch became a breeze to knit because you could just read your knitting and you didn't have to memorize the full repeat anymore. But experienced knitters will know that this concept goes way beyond little bumps and V's in your fabric. Because after all, there are more than 20 ways to cast on stitches, more than 20 ways to bind off stitches. There are just as many ways to increase or decrease stitches. And if you pick out one of these increases or decreases or bind-offs or cast-ons, then you will quickly notice that there are often 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 ways, 10 different ways to knit that specific increase or decrease. And an experienced knitter will be able to leverage that knowledge to achieve a neater outcome. So let me give you a couple of examples. The possibly easiest way to create a left-leaning decrease is knit two together through the back loop. That is possibly your easiest left-leaning decrease. Instead of that, you can also knit SSK. Slip one, slip another one, and then knit them together through the back loop. Then, some knitters might know that you could also slip one knitwise, slip one purlwise, and then knit them together through the back loop. For some, this looks neater. You can also slip one knitwise, slip one knitwise, knit them together, and then you yank out this stitch to tighten up this stitch that will end up laying on top for a neater left-leaning decrease. You can also do it like this. Slip one knitwise, slip one knitwise, knit them together through the back loop, then yank out, and then for the next stitch you carry that extra slack over to the next stitch, and this will create an even tighter stitch. But you can also create a left-leaning decrease like so. Enter the first stitch knitwise, then enter the second stitch here through the back loop, grab the yarn, and now this is tricky. You only pull the yarn here through the first stitch, drop that stitch, and then you yank out the yarn here, and you drop the second stitch and continue knitting. And lastly, you could also decrease on the wrong side with SSP. So you slip one knitwise, slip another one knitwise, and then you purl these two stitches here. Might be a little bit more difficult. You purl these two stitches through the back loop, and on the right side it will create the same left-leaning decrease. And if you take a look at the swatch 2 rows later, you can see that all these decreases create a left-leaning decrease, and most of them are technically the exact same stitch. However, you will notice that not all of them are as neat as the others. So here we are rather sloppy, and then over here, can you even spot the SSP? Here there is the SSP. It's almost unnoticeable. Now, neither I nor anyone else can tell you which decrease of these will look better for you. So it's very, very important to understand that. So I see so many people recommending SSPK, slip, slip, purl, knit. For me, it's rather sloppy, but for others, it's very, very neat. And that is because different knitters stretch out the stitches one row below differently. So all these stitches here, these are one row below. I knitted these here on the wrong side. And then as I knit one stitch, I'm actively forcing two needles into one stitch, and this enlarges them. And depending on my style, there might be further leveraging around, which enlarges this stitch even more. These differences are at their greatest between different knitting styles, say English knitting, combination knitting, Portuguese knitting, Eastern knitting, continental knitting, or maybe you just do continental knitting but do the Norwegian purl. So only you can find out what's best for you. That's why swatches are so powerful. Don't trust me or that gatekeeping lady at your local knitting meetup who always knows it best. Of course she does. Instead, cast on 10 stitches with some scrap yarn that has been idling around your stash for a decade or so and find out yourself. But it's important to realize that this goes way beyond mere exchange. It's also about understanding stitch anatomy. So I can do a yarn over to increase one stitch. Instead of that, I can also do a make one left. So make one left is also always when this strand here is leaning towards the left and you knit it through the back loop. And then when I come to my little yarn over here in the next row, I purl it through the back loop. Technically speaking, both will result in the exact same increase. So here, this is make one left, and this here was the yarn over purled through the back loop in the next row. So you can see they look exactly the same. The difference is that make one left manipulates the row below while the yarn over adds slack. So you might be able to see how this creates a slightly bigger eyelet than this one here. To illustrate, when you create make one left makes use here of this strand here. When you create a yarn over, let's create a yarn over here. And then I'm going to drop the yarn over one more time. See, the yarn over will vanish here into the same strand, but now this strand here is longer. So this explains why the yarn over increase creates the bigger eyelet. And if you do a backward loop increase, or rather a reverse backward loop increase, like so, then you will still technically create the exact same stitch, but because you are twisting it right away, you will add even more slack here. Let's show you. You will even add more slack here to that stitch, and that strand will even be longer. Technically, you still create the same left-leaning increase. Now these increases have one big problem. Say you cast on 5 stitches and you want to increase in the very center. Make one left, the yarn over, whatever, only allows you to increase in between one stitch, and that's why you have things like KFB, knit front and knit back, to increase right here in the center. Instead of KFB, you can also knit the front and only slip the back. And then you have lifted increases like KLL, where you go into the stitch here 2 rows below, lift it back to your knitting needle, and then knit that here through the back loop. And if we take a look at these two versions 2 rows later, you might be able to see that technically speaking, these are the exact same stitch. It's just a different way to get there. And there's also another difference here, or two differences. So here for me, the cave knit front slip back version is a little bit looser than the lifted increase, but also the relative position here. So if you do the knit front slip back, the increase is sitting one row higher. So you're doing it one row later. So it's the exact same with make one left or the yarn over. Make one left manipulates a row below, while yarn over and then knit through the back loop is a row later. So this can also be very, very helpful for certain patterns. If you go to my blog, you will find a very, very extensive knitting technique library with tons of pictures, slow motion, tutorials, videos, close-up pictures, swatches, and so on. And I really invite you to go through it. Use some scrap yarn and simply try out a couple of different ways to cast on, bind off, increase or decrease. Challenge yourself to find techniques that work well for you and not just for me. So this here is a standard longtail cast on. You are probably familiar with this technique. But instead of a longtail cast on, I can also cast on stitches with the single cast on, thumb method, e-cast on, whatever. Just chain a couple of stitches like so. And then in the next row here, I am purling all of these stitches here through the back loop. See? I'm working across by purling all stitches here through the back loop. And then if you compare the two versions, you will notice that technically they create the exact same edge. However, here with the single cast on, it's quite a bit looser, while the longtail cast on around one needle here is quite tight. But the edge it creates, see these slopes here? With a twisted stitch here on top, it's the exact same thing. And by the way, if you feel the German twisted cast on is a little bit too difficult for you, well, then start with the single cast on, the same single cast on, but then in the next row on the wrong side, you purl across. So ironically speaking, the German twisted cast on uses purl stitches, while the longtail cast on is twisted purl stitches, but that's that. So if you know how these stitches work, the next time, but only if you know how they work, the next time a pattern tells you to cave B, knit front and back, you may simply ignore that and use a lifted increase instead, or if it's a German twisted cast on, well, then use the single cast on and purl across the second row. It will make such a big difference for you and the neatness of your projects. I mean, a lot of designers pick their increases and decreases with care, but others, and I really want to be honest here, others simply because that's all they know, or it's always been done like that in their culture or knitting community. And if you ask me, a knitting pattern is always just a vessel where you can pour in your creativity. If you don't change anything, not the size, not the yarn, not the color, one could even go as far as questioning why you don't go to a store in the first place. You know, honestly, it's going to be cheaper and faster. So I think the power of hand knitting comes when you make your own choices. But first, so to be in that position, you need to know the possibilities, and that's why learning about new stitches and new ways to knit these stitches is so important. Let me ask you a question. Do you buy a house based on the color of the walls or if the front porch decoration is a vibe? Well, no, you don't. So please tell me, why do so many knitters buy yarn for a project based on color and things like softness? It really doesn't make any sense. Just as you want to make sure the walls are sound and the floor plan kind of makes sense when you buy a house, we really need to talk about fiber and spinning techniques first when it comes to buying yarn. Color and softness, that's just an afterthought. So really, one of the most important tips I can give any beginner is learn about different fibers. So the first tool I really want to highlight here is yarnsub.com. I'm not affiliated with them or so, but it's just such a great resource because you can enter just about any commercial yarn and it will spit out a couple of alternatives that you can use for your pattern without messing up the gauge too much or, the general characteristics of your fabric. So if you feel the yarn a designer or a pattern uses is too expensive, too scratchy, not vegan, or not available in your country, well, use yarnsub.com and it will typically list you 5 or 10 alternatives. But also invest some time and learn more about different fibers. So here, this is a very, very, very lovely book by Clara Parks, the Book of Yarn or the Knitter's Book of Yarn. And it's really such a great place to get started. I mean, it's not a research paper, so she kind of stays on the surface. But for a beginner, that's what you want. First you need to understand the basics and, someone to break it really down to you before you can read these research papers. And then if you go to my blog, you will find quite a couple of articles on different kinds of yarns like alpaca yarn, camel wool, or even rare things like vicuña yarn and their properties, where I really break it down because there's so many urban myths floating around the internet. Like, alpaca yarn was cooling and it was great for summer knits. Well, it turns out it really isn't, but it's based on an old myth that alpaca fibers are hollow inside. Well, they are hollow, but just the coarse guard hairs, the downs, they are not hollow inside, so there's no cooling effect for those and things like that. But it takes time to learn about them, and once you do, then you can make great choices. A dishcloth in linen or cotton yarn might just be perfect because these fibers can wick away a lot of moisture very, very fast. Use the same fibers for some leg warmers and the results might be a little bit underwhelming because they will stretch out but never spring back, and then the leg warmers won't stay put anymore. And similar things can be said about alpaca yarn because the individual fibers don't have a lot of crimp, meaning they are not as curly as, say, sheep wool. So it's not as elastic and doesn't spring back a lot. So as a result, if you knit a sweater in alpaca yarn, it can often wear out dramatically and your fitted sweater suddenly looks more like a poncho. I mean, also nice, but probably not what you intended. Or let's talk about superwash yarns where the individual little scales on the hairs have been scored away chemically so the fibers doesn't felt. It can be great for socks because it enables you to wash them in a machine instead of just hand washing. However, if you use a superwash yarn for color work, then the results might be equally underwhelming because it doesn't felt, the fibers don't lock, so the floats will over time the floats will start running away. However, if you use for the same color work, if you use a little yarn that is a little bit more rustic, has a little fluffiness to it, your color work will look stunning because the floats will felt over and also the little fluffs will fill in these little holes where you can see the floats peeking through. So it's all about these choices, but first you need to understand them. And it's just as important to understand spinning. So in front of me here are 2 single ply yarns, and as you can see, There are no different strands, it's just this one strand here forming one little cord, and they can be very, very warm and pretty. So single ply can be perfect for hats or shawls or scarves or so. They don't see much wear and tear. So here, this is a lace quality, also a single ply. Can you see this? A single ply yarn. And this will create, as you can see, very, very nice and plump stitches without much bias, because there is not much twist in there. So lace patterns also benefit from these single ply yarns. But expose this fabric to any kind of stress like a sweater or socks, and it will felt and fall apart and peel faster than you can say, oh no. Your average sock yarn, on the other hand, is typically 4-ply, sometimes also called fingering yarn. So you have basically 4 single-ply yarns, and you spin and twist them together, and this adds a lot more durability, but the yarn also becomes a little bit denser and less lofty. So typically, this means a much nicer and more uniform stitch definition and more durability. So here, this is all 4-ply yarn, sock yarn, or like lace weight, and you can see what a wonderful and nice and smooth stitch definition this creates. So 4-ply yarns are also very, very nice for cables, as you can see. They really let them shine and create nice and wonderful 3-dimensional structures without a lot of bias or a visible lean or slant, and the stitches all look nice and uniform. If you spin 2 strands of fingering weight yarn together, you get an 8-ply yarn, sometimes also called a double knit yarn, double knit weight. And this extra twist, of course, adds even more durability. However, it also adds extra twist to your fabric. Of course, the more you ply your yarn together, the more spin you add. So often stockinette stitch can look a little bit weird, but also things like ribbing and cables. So they kind of, for lack of a better word, well, they lose distinction, and you focus more on the little plies and how it's the structure of the yarn and less on the overall structure. So this is always a little issue of DK yarns. And these days a lot of thicker sock yarn quality. So traditionally there was just a fingering weight and then double knit yarn, which was using the same spinning machines basically. But these days you also have 6-ply yarn, so thicker sock qualities are often 6-ply. But even there you will often notice that the stitch definition starts to suffer, and you see a lot of extra twist doing its thing in the fabric. So that is certainly something you will notice. And another thing you will notice is that the plies typically also come apart quite easily. So this will happen when you unravel a piece, or for example, if you do a very, very long tail cast on and you don't take countermeasures, you will see how the yarn sort of falls apart, or say a very long Latvian braid or so, or simply because you wound your skein counterclockwise and then you do a center pull. This can also lead to quite a bit of bias in your fabric, or if you do it the other way around, the plies can come apart. So this is certainly one of the bigger issues of these highly spun yarns that you should be aware of. But please, 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 don't think in terms of, well, good or bad or in absolute terms like that, because single ply yarns, you know, they might felt easily, but you can use this to your advantage and knit and then felt beautiful house slippers like this one here for your whole family very, very quickly. Or here 6-ply or 8-ply DK yarns, they can be perfect if you want to knit some socks that will experience quite a little wear and tear. Then an 8-ply yarn will be perfect to reinforce these heels here so they don't wear through as quickly. So there are no bad yarns, or well, there are, but you know, a 4-ply yarn or an 8-ply yarn or a single-ply yarn, 6-ply, whatever, it's not inherently better or worse than the other. It's just that some use cases are better for the 4-ply and some for the 8-ply yarn. Overall, I would say that you should probably invest more time in finding yarn than you probably think you should, and really use Ravelry or Instagram is also a very great resource, because popular patterns often have hundreds or sometimes even thousands of finished projects, or there are, you know, popular hashtags on Instagram for these patterns. You can research, browse through them, and then learn which fibers and yarns and colors truly work, and then pick something similar. Because often I see a pattern and I go like, well, I really don't, I kind of don't like it. And then I browse through the projects and someone picked a different yarn and a different color combination than the designer, and I go like, wow, I really want to knit that. So it's sometimes kind of weird like that, but so it takes a little bit of time and effort, but the more input you give your brain, the more pictures and alternatives you see, the more your creativity has to work with. And so, for example, if you've never seen someone using ripped up jeans to knit a market bag, you won't be able to gauge if that is actually a good choice or not. So really invest some time and just scroll through Ravelry before you cast on, because that's often a great choice. Now, just finding the right fiber and yarn is typically not enough. You also need to pick the right color, and in these days and ages where the choices are so abundant, I mean, luckily, it often seems like a daunting task, but really it's not even difficult. All you need is a color wheel. So pick a base color and then go through the options. Match them with your hair and skin type, and that's basically it. I mean, it sounds easy, but it is that easy because these days you have apps, and most apps even allow you to upload like a picture, and then it will turn it into a color scheme, or they will recommend, there are also apps that will recommend a color that will go really, really well with your complexion and your hair color. So just download that or go online and use them. Now, I have a full tutorial here on YouTube where I show you exactly how you can find the perfect yarn for your project. I'll link it to you up in here. That being said, the biggest issue I see among knitters these days, because indie yarn dyers have become so popular, is that they see a nice colorway like these two here, and they go like, oh, this looks very pretty. And yes, it's pretty, but the skeins, they don't need to be pretty. What needs to be pretty is the resulting fabric. And I mean, I don't want to shame any indie yarn dyers here, because there are so many outstanding artists out there who are just so knowledgeable about dyeing fibers and knitting. But there are also just as many who, you know, simply create beautiful skeins. And then if you don't know what you are doing and you don't alternate skeins and stuff like that, the resulting fabric will often look a little bit like you left a big box of crayons unattended at a children's birthday. And in the worst case, you end up with yarn pooling or sewn. So as a beginner, I would typically lean towards simpler yarns in one color. If you ask me, a colorway such as this or this is meant for advanced knitters who really know what they are doing and how to deal with the complexities such a unique dye introduces. They know how to alternate, how and when to alternate skeins, how and when to join another colorway. Like if you knit sleeves, things like that, it actually becomes quite a little bit difficult, and this is better left for advanced knitters. Before I go on, here's a quick little note. A video like this one here takes more than 40 or 50 hours to create, and really YouTube doesn't pay me all that well. So if you want to ensure that I will be in a position to create more videos such as this one here for you tomorrow, then kindly consider supporting me on Patreon, even if it's just for a month. I'll add the link to the description below. I am not aware of a single technique that is more magical than blocking, and it really needs to be mentioned in this video as well. I'm still amazed how many knitters decide to skip that step. You start with a wonky little swatch, soak it in lukewarm water for 30 minutes, pin it down, and out comes a beautiful piece of lace. Now I have a full tutorial here on YouTube where I show you the ins and outs of blockings and many tips, so I don't want to bore the more experienced knitters here. Still, it's very important to realize that the different fibers need to be treated differently. You cannot block cotton or acrylic yarn the same way you would block sheep wool or alpaca yarn. And if you block a tubular project without a special blocking board or using foam cores, you will end up with permanent fold lines that don't really look nice here along the sides of your sweater or so, or your hats or so. But really, if you've ever wondered why my swatches and projects look so neat, then I can tell you that the number one reason is that I block consistently. If I could take a guess, then I would say that 90% of all beginners don't block their work. They hate weaving in ends, and most importantly, they never knit a swatch such as, this one here. And it's easy to lull yourself into believing this is not needed. And of course, it is annoying, it's time consuming, and it doesn't really result in anything you could ever wear or use. I mean, you could use it for yarn bombing or some weird kind of scrap blanket, but that's about it. However, this little swatch here tells me exactly how my colorway looks when knitted up, or how the pattern and the fiber and the color work together. Are they a good match or aren't they? Because sometimes they aren't, and it's better to notice on a swatch than halfway through your sweater. If you measure your swatch before and after blocking, it will also tell you how the fiber behaves, because sometimes you knit a sweater and it fits really well hot off the needles, and then you wear it a couple of times and you wash it and it's way too large. And if you did your swatches properly, then you can prevent these mishaps. Or it can also tell you things about stitch definition, and this is typically very important when it comes to color work, where floats and different colors can peek through. Then you knit one swatch in 2mm needles and another swatch using 2.5mm needles, and then you compare and you go like, okay, this needle size looks a little bit better. And things like ribbing, cables or so also often need smaller needles. Some forms of color work or lace needs bigger needles. And only if you knit your swatch or knit a couple of swatches, that's the only way to answer these questions. Or also, I sometimes get questions like, I need to steek my cardigan. I need to cut it open here in the middle and I'm scared. Well, what on earth is preventing you from using your little swatch as a practice piece? Steek your swatch, try it out, and then when you need to actually steek and cut open your cardigan, your tubular project, it's gonna be less scary. So I actually feel swatches are magic. And experienced knitters might have noticed that I specifically have not talked about gauge here. Yes, a swatch like where is it? A swatch like this one here is a crutch, or rather a great crutch, to approximate the tension of the designer and make a garment that fits in a similar way. Or when you want to draft your own patterns, a swatch is essential. But if you ask me, that's the least reason why you should knit a swatch. I mean, first of all, I believe that the way gauge is typically obtained is fundamentally flawed, but that's beside the point here. A truly great project is often a combination of a great knitter and great yarn choices, and a couple of swatches can confirm these choices. I've seen too many knitters noticing halfway through their project that they hate the yarn. And I would say, if only they spent 50 minutes to knit a swatch instead. When I started knitting, I typically unravel my whole work or huge parts of it whenever I noticed a mistake. Possibly because I learned crochet first, and in crochet you really have to unravel to get to a mistake. So I'm not even joking that it probably was like 16 or so when I learned about fixing mistakes with a crochet hook of all things, so the irony of it. And it was probably another 5 years later or so that I learned that you can simply add an afterthought lifeline and then easily unravel to that point in a very controlled manner to fix the mistakes. And possibly only in the recent decade or so did I feel proficient enough to fix larger mistakes in a project like cables or so, or complex lace patterns, which is also entirely doable, but you really kind of need to know how to do that. Now, I have a full tutorial here on YouTube where I show you how to fix mistakes, like 10 different ways and 10 different important techniques, and how to unravel properly and so on. I'll link it to you up in here. The more important message here is that knowing how to fix a mistake is only the first step. What separates the master knitters from the beginners is often the willingness to fix a mistake, the willingness to start all over again. Because some mistakes are really just minor and you can easily ignore them. Nobody will see them later on. Other mistakes are so problematic that they might actually compromise the fit or the appearance of the whole project. And then you need to be bold enough to unravel, learn from your mistakes, take some notes, and then start all over again. However, I see so many beginners thinking that unraveling was an admission of failure, and it's not. It's part of a learning process. So when I draft a new pattern or so, you don't really want to know how often I unravel, how often I need to start all over again. And nobody in their right mind would expect to paint like Leonardo da Vinci after your first painting lesson. Heck, modern X-ray technique shows that even he often had to redo things, start all over again, paint over stuff. So why on earth would a beginner think that could achieve the perfect fitting sock, sweater, hat or so on their first try? Knitting creates a very complex fabric that is elastic, and it often takes multiple tries to approximate the fit. And that's just part of the process and really not failure. Failure is, if you ask me, if you have a project that doesn't fit perfectly and you can't really wear it, and then you don't learn from your mistakes and improve. That is failure. Unraveling, I don't think it is. And in that context, I specifically want to mention that a lot of beginners seem to skip from one pattern to the next. They knit a sweater or some socks they saw in a magazine and it looks spectacular, and then they actually don't turn out to be spectacular because they are beginners. And then they look for another pattern that is supposed to deliver superior results, and well, they don't. So rather, I urge you to pick as a beginner, pick time-proven patterns that are tech-edited and then knit the same pattern a couple of times. So, and the second time around, once you understand what you're doing, you can adjust all these little mistakes you did the first time. Cast on more stitches, pick a different cast on, allow for more ease or less ease, and so on. And then make sure that you use the exact same yarn base. I mean, you can pick a different color, but you use the exact same yarn base So you don't need to fiddle around with gauge one more time, and you can make sure that the second time around your sweater, your socks actually fit. And you can also use this opportunity to introduce small little changes. Maybe the cuff or the hem didn't, in a 2x2 ribbing, didn't look all that nice. Well, then use a 2x1 ribbing, or knit all the purl stitches through the back loop for neither ribbing, and ribbing, and then compare the results. Because it's also important to realize that it takes time and practice to understand the concept behind a pattern, the concept behind socks, hats, or sweaters. That's why I always say you have to knit one sock before I can actually teach you how to knit socks. If you've never knitted a gusset, then telling you tips and tricks to avoid this annoying little hole right around the gusset, well, they won't connect. But if you've ever knitted some mittens and picked up stitches here for the thumb, or you knitted a sweater and then you notice, okay, there's a hole here around the armpit, then when I tell you a technique or a method to avoid it, then things will connect. But before that, typically they don't, and you just kind of stay on the surface. So I feel as a beginner you really need to dive down. Here's one example. For years I've been decreasing or increasing my raglan sweaters in every second row, until I realized, well, the only reason designers are doing this is because it looks consistently, and everyone does it that way. But if you think about it, it actually doesn't really make any sense. So suppose we have, here's one example. So we have identical twins, but their lifestyles diverge, and one is petite and the other is quite a bit wider. But of course, both will still have the same overall bone structure and thus the same sky depth. So from here to here, where you place your raglan increases or decreases. But one of them will need dramatically more stitches for the torso and the sleeves to accommodate their girth. And I will tell you what will happen. The larger person will end up knitting 20 more rows to get to their bust circumference, ending up with tons of excess fabric in places they absolutely don't want it. The fabric will bunch up below the armpits, and it will create like weird little wrinkles on top of their bust, and that is because they increased in every second row instead of increasing faster. Because they start with more stitches, but they need to cover the same sky depth. Well, then you need to increase or decrease faster. So in essence, I want you to know, no matter your body shape, no matter if you're male, female, trans, if you have wider hips, broader shoulder, smaller waist, higher insteps, longer fingers, missing limbs, whatever, there are solutions out there for all these problems. But first, you need to understand the overall construction of a pattern. How does it actually work? And then you can introduce change, research it, and often tinker around yourself a little bit if you're, well, how should I say this? If your body shape deviates a little bit more from the classic size S and M. But there are solutions, and if I feel also you should approach any pattern with a little critical eye, and when you read something you go like, okay, does this make sense? Do these measurements line up? Because this is also very, very important, and will prevent a lot of mishaps, because sometimes I read a pattern and I'm like, okay, this just cannot work out. And then you can either decide to skip it or introduce change. Probably one of the biggest mysteries in knitting is tension. Sometimes it kind of feels like either you have it or you don't. And I know a lot of beginners, they watch a lot of videos and how other people tension yarn, and they try to replicate it, and they go like, this can't be so hard, but it kind of is. And as a result, I mean, like, if your purl tension is off, every flat project in stockinette stitch will look very weird, and every knit purl combination in the round will look very, very loosey-goosey. So what's the trick here? Now here's how I tension my yarn. So I wrap my yarn around the pinky finger twice, and if it's a sticky yarn, maybe just once. Then I guide it here across the back of my hand and pick up my needles like so. And the important bit is, after every stitch that I've knitted, I tighten it up by lifting the index finger a little bit. So I knit the stitch, and while the stitch is still on the needle, I tighten up and then I slip. And this tiny little motion, this tiny little lifting motion helps me to maintain an even tension. Of course, some people also wrap the yarn here around the index finger, and then they do the exact same thing. I recently recorded a full video here on YouTube where I show you exactly how I tension my yarn, how I knit stitches, purl stitches in super slow motion from various different angles, so you can see what all my fingers are doing, how I really tension my yarn. I'll add a link to the description below. But in this video, I would rather like to stress that the system I developed works for me. So please also look at other people here on YouTube, or maybe go to a local knitting meetup and then actively check how other people tension their yarn. Try to replicate things, pick certain things that might work for your hands and your body, and then practice. Perfect tension will not come overnight. It took me 35 years, so don't expect it to learn this in a day or two, because often I see people switching to crutches way too soon. They switch to Norwegian purling because they feel continental purling is too difficult. They switch needle sizes for the purl rows, or also very popular backward knitting. I can't tell you how often I get comments praising backward knitting and how easy it is to avoid purling. Sometimes they even go as far as saying it would be so much better than the techniques I am showing. And I can tell you, these crutches will often get you only so far. Setting aside that I don't personally feel that purling is difficult at all, what does backward knitting help you when you need to knit, I don't know, 2x2 ribbing in the round? Well, how do you avoid purling with backward knitting there? And if you knit a complex lace project with many, I don't know, purl two together through the back loops and other complex stitches, then you will quickly notice that Norwegian purling, or I don't know, combination knitting, doesn't actually facilitate things, but it makes things a lot more difficult. Now please note that I'm not saying that these styles are not valid. I mean, that would be kind of stupid, because there are millions of knitters out there who are very comfortable with them. What I'm trying to get across here is that they are not easier in and by themselves. They introduce different challenges, and it's very important to recognize them. I know how frustrating it can be to learn purling, or how to perfect your tension. It took me quite some time as well, but as a rule of thumb, I would first stay within a general knitting style. May that be English knitting, continental knitting, and so on. Because you actually, if I go to my local knitting meetup, there are 20 continental knitters, and I can tell you that all these 20 knitters purl differently and tension their yarn differently. So if you are frustrated with the way I or someone else teaches you how to purl continental style, then first look up other continental knitters and try to pick up how they handle things. And I feel, if you're patient with yourself, that is so much more rewarding than switching knitting styles on a whim. Another factor I would like to highlight in this video here are finishing skills. We already talked about blocking, but there's also sieving, picking up stitches, grafting, weaving in ends, and so on. For me personally, my probably biggest epiphany was when I learned about sharp tapestry needles, sometimes also called a chenille needle. So this is a normal tapestry needle with a blunt tip, and this one is a sharp tapestry needle. So when you want to weave in ends with a blunt tapestry needle, you kind of need to weasel around the stitches, and it's very annoying, and you can well understand why people don't like it. And when you use a sharp tapestry needle, you can just glide through the stitches diagonally and pierce them like so. And it's, you know, just one smooth motion, and if you didn't lose lotion on your hands like I did here, it's actually remarkably easy to pull things through. And there is your secured tail. It literally takes 10 seconds, and with a blunt tapestry needle, weaving in ends is both more annoying and it takes like 10 times as much time. So this really was such an epiphany for me. Another such epiphany was understanding the Kitchener stitch. I know a lot of people hate it to a point where they rather knit socks toe up so they don't have to do it, but it's actually remarkably simple. So in front of me is a swatch and stockinette stitch, but done on 20mm needles, so you can really see the stitches. And we have this one row here in a contrasting yarn. And the Kitchener stitch basically is nothing else but trying to graft stitches just like this row here in this orange yellow color. So you start with 2 preparational stitches, and then it's always the same repeat. So here you have this meandering line, and you exit that stitch through the front, and then you enter the adjacent stitch here through the back. Then you move up, exit through the front, enter through the back, move down, exit through the front, enter through the back, exit through the front, enter through the back. Always this meandering line. That's all you need to remember. And in case you are wondering if you want to do the purl stitch, it's exactly the other way around. So you exit through the back, enter through the front, exit through the back, enter through the front. That's all there is. Let's do that on the needles. Exit the stitch through the front, drop it, enter the stitch through the back. Then you move up, exit the stitch through the front. Remember, front is here. Exit through the front, enter through the back. One more time. Exit through the front, enter through the back. Exit through the front, enter through the back. That's all you need to remember. Now, I have a full video here on YouTube focused on finishing skills for knitters. Do watch this if you want to learn more about it. But I can only stress here that it's just so easy to mess up the perfect project simply because you didn't know there was a garter stitch version of the mattress stitch that lays even flatter. Or when it comes to seaming, a lot of people love slip stitch selvages and think they look pretty, but if you want to seam 2 slip stitch selvages together, it's just so much more likely to create holes or when you pick up stitches from them. It typically doesn't look pretty, and a garter stitch or stockinette stitch selvage is so much better for seaming. And the list goes on. So when you bound off the last stitch of your project, that's when 20% of the work still remain, and if you skip those steps, you can't really expect to see the same results as the designer. Now here's a little bonus tip. You can't imagine how often I get the question, Norman, can I knit this? I don't have double pointed knitting needles. Can I knit this with circular knitting needles? And it's come to a point where this question not only annoys me, but almost offends me, because do whatever brings you joy and is easier for you. I would say 99% of all sock patterns, hat patterns, gloves, whatever, can be finished with either circulars and the magic loop technique or double pointed knitting needles. It doesn't matter, and if you are so inclined, you could even knit with the Chagu minis, these super short 2-inch tips. If it's easier for you, use that. A knitting pattern, just because the knitting pattern has double pointed knitting needles on the cover or something like that, doesn't mean you have to use them as well. In a way, I feel like we are back in primary school and the teacher uses like red chalk to write something on the chalkboard, and then someone raises their hand and asks, well, Mr. Teacher, I don't have a red crayon, can I use a green one? That's how I feel when someone asks me if they can use circulars. Now, I mean, I don't want to do like say this in a condescending way, because as a beginner I probably didn't know that either. So of course I answer in it kindly, but I really want to get this across. Use what you feel is better. I love double-pointed knitting needles, and if you love circular needles and the magic loop techniques, or you love to knit 2 at a time, this doesn't offend me. Actually, it brings me joy that you found something that works so well for you, that you are knitting, and that's all that matters. The rest, it doesn't. Now here at the end I want to address, well, 4 things really. First of all, I spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect angle, the perfect accessories to frame all my pictures and videos. Sometimes the difference between a project that wows you and a project that doesn't really excite you is just good lighting, or maybe a very well chosen background instead of a cluttered desk. And in that context, you have to be aware that almost all pictures you see on social media and most videos are highly edited. These days, even AI-generated pictures seem to take over the knitting world. And if you compare your your work with that unreality, nothing good will come out of it. Now, of course, I do edit my projects, typically not a lot because I'm lazy and my videos never get any color grading because I don't really see the point. But that, of course, I mean, they don't look horrible to begin with, but just like blocking and the right finishing technique, editing and lighting, well, maybe it's just 5%, but each of them, it kind of adds up. And a third thing I want to highlight here is that typically you only get to see the good finished objects and rarely the disasters, especially on social media, where the algorithm tends to surface either the very good or the very bad, but not a lot in between. And for me personally, there are also practical reasons behind that. When I develop a pattern, I will unravel a lot, start all over again, but I don't take breaks to take pictures of that, because this would mean I would have to go to the studio, switch on the lighting, grab my camera and so on, interrupt my cozy knitting, losing my train of thoughts and, disturbing the creative process. And similarly, if I didn't edit out all the little mistakes I make in my tutorials, I think it would simply confuse a lot of beginners who want to see how it's done properly once, because they want to knit along, and if there's a mistake in it, they go like, oh, I need to unravel this, well, this is kind of confusing. So I kind of feel it needs to be perfect. I mean, all these mistakes might be interesting later on. It's sort of in a way, okay, Norman makes mistakes as well. That makes me feel so much better about it. Oh, and this is how he fixes it. Yeah, that's kind of neat. This might be of interest later on, but in the beginning, when you want to learn a technique, I feel it's confusing. And this kind of careful editing, this careful curation happens big and small. If your neighbor is proud of a finished project, they might be inclined to share it with the world. But if it's just another, dishcloth with scrap yarn, they're not really excited about it. Why share it? That's just 5 minutes of their time they could spend elsewhere. But either way, you only get to see an edited version of reality online, even in all those cases where things are supposedly unedited and unfiltered. Even then, in these instances, an influencer, a content creator like me carefully selects them and only shares them when I see value. If I see, this adds value to me, but not all the disasters. And again, if you compare yourself with that, it's bound to lead to imposter syndrome, needlessly so. Just like comparing your chapter 1 to my chapter 10, I've been knitting for more than 35 years, and for the past 4 years I've been doing this professionally, knitting every day, teaching knitting every day, researching knitting every day. I mean, there's certainly talent, genetics and luck, But those only work in concert with practice, and I've had a lot of practice. So of course my projects or the projects of any other knitting content creator you might see online might look a little bit better than yours, simply because you are not yet at this point in your knitting journey. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found my little tips and tricks and the little concepts I shared and talked about it helpful. Comment below if you have any questions, suggestions, or you would like to add something. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.